When we hear the name Jack, we may think of Jack the Lad or Jack of all trades. We may think of Jack and Jill or Jack and the Beanstalk. Some may even think of Kate Winslet whispering the name whilst DiCaprio slowly disappears into the freezing waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. But if we were to instead move our focus of the name onto 19th century London, suppose I were to mention the name Jack in a conversation about murder, attacks on women, and a shadowy figure lurking in the dark corners of the British alleyways of Victorian London. In that case, there is no doubt in my mind that you would automatically think of the sinister killer that was so colourfully named Jack the Ripper. But what you may not know was that this Jack was, in fact, the second of its namesake to terrorise the streets of London in the 1800s. Another came far earlier, lasted far longer, and spread as far as Scotland with reports of its attacks. I say it, as to many, this sinister being was no man at all. My name is Luke Mordew, and this urban legend is Spring-Heeled Jack. Mass hysteria created by a mixture of eyewitness accounts, press manipulation, liars looking for attention, misunderstandings, hyperbole, and connections drawn by coincidental events were the reason a sudden burst of UFO sightings occurred across America in the 20th century. We all fall into the same traps of our imagination, following the same mysteries that fill our minds with fear and our hearts with morbid excitement. We are all suckers to word of mouth and gossip, believing hearsay as fact. This is one of the main factors in the longevity of any urban legend. Even Jack the Ripper's iconic name was coined by a letter published by the press, a press that we know was falsifying Ripper letters across the country. When we picture old Jack the Ripper, we imagine him in his tall hat, long cape, and cane. Although this aristocratic image of the killer itself did not appear until the 1960s, almost an entire century later. In reality, the very few sightings of a man who was believed to be the Ripper did not fit these descriptions. Up until the 1960s, the murderer was depicted as an averagely dressed man with a shadowy secret in his eye. We believe what we want to believe because it makes the story we are hearing or retelling more exciting. Our version of Jack the Ripper has now become an educated, influential, devilish figure who eloquently wrote letters to the press in a taunting manner. We follow this because it's so much more enticing than the alternative. That a mentally unhinged, working-class man living amongst Whitechapel was letting out his hatred of women and dumping the bodies to be found later. I have talked so much about Jack the Ripper because it would be strange not to mention the apparent similarities between the place, timeline, and name. The embellishments during this time also led to the killer becoming much more of an urban legend in their own way, one that stems from relatively strong roots in reality. Jack the Ripper was made to be a demonic presence of a man, wandering the back alleys of London. Spring-Heeled Jack was not considered a man, but a ghost, a demon, and to some, even the devil himself. My telling of the story will differ in this chapter. As always, I have written it in my own words, but this time I will tell the stories of incidents that indeed occurred, or at least as they were recorded and remembered to have occurred way back in the early days of 1838. The city of London was bitterly cold that February in the first half of the 19th century. Jane was sitting by the fire, reading a book to entertain herself until it was time for bed, whilst her father was out on errands and her sister was napping in her room. A chill ran up her spine in a sudden burst of cold air, as if a dark presence had somehow just passed through her body. As if by instinct, She turned to the window behind her, to the darkness of the city, only lit by the gas lights along the road outside. She studied it for a moment as the moonlight bounced off her pale skin before putting the book down, making sure to mark her page and get into her feet. She crept towards the window, a strange feeling that she was being watched overpowering her thoughts. Anxiety had swept upon her in an instant, and now she could not help but see the world around her with suspicious eyes, as if the calmness of the night was a lie, hiding its reality in the shadow. She looked down at the road below to see nobody there. She looked to her left to see a carriage carting off. To her right, a couple was turning a corner onto a street out of view. The slight haze of the fog was glistening amongst the blues of the moonlight, mixing with the reds of the firelights below. Nothing out of the ordinary was around, yet Jane did not believe it. In a moment of clarity, deciding to shake off the foolishness she was allowing to control her actions, she turned and began to walk back to the warmth of the fire once more, when she was disturbed by the sudden ringing of her father's front gate out front. She was unsure if it was a strange feeling of the unsettling darkness outside, or because there seemed to be nobody there not moments ago. But she found herself hesitating, waiting a moment whilst the ringing occurred again, this time heavier and more frantic. She paced down the stairs and into the hall, slowly edging towards the house's front door, flinching ever so slightly as the ringing of the impatient visitor continued. Finally, she reached out, unlocking the door and swinging it open with a sudden burst of confidence. "Would you not ring so loud?" she exclaimed. The cloaked man at the gate shook impatiently, shouting, "For God's sake, bring me a light, for we have caught Spring Hill Jack here in the lane." Jane was shocked. She had heard rumours of Jack's attacks and his trickery and nightmarish behaviour. She had not fully admitted to herself the possibility that it was true. Perhaps this is why she felt an unease in the night. Perhaps she could feel his presence close by. Jane did not hesitate for long, turning sharply and grabbing a candle that rested on the table. She had never been one to dive into excitement before, only experiencing them in the books she read from the safety of her home. But now she was to face the devilish creature known as Spring-Hilled Jack that had terrorized the city for so long. She stepped out into the fog, pacing towards the man that she believed to be a police officer, and handed him the candle. But the moment she did, the violent cackle of Spring-Heeled Jack emitted from his mouth. Within an instant, it had dropped the candle to the floor and whipped off its long coat to reveal what she could only describe as a most hideous and frightful appearance. It wore a helmet upon its head that she could have sworn was not there moments before, and clothes that resembled white oilskin, a waterproof garment typical amongst fishermen and sailors at the time, tightly fitting around its body. Enjoying the surprise it had created, the phantom stood proudly in the dim light of the flickering flame. Jane opened her mouth to scream, but before she could, it was already staring into her eyes, revealing nothing but fiery balls of ember as it opened its mouth, vomiting blue and white flames from the back of its throat. Jane stumbled back and screamed as she covered herself with her arms from the embers, but by now it had already pounced, now leaping towards her with its sharp, metallic claws drawn and ready to inflict pain and corruption on her body. It cackled as it tore away at her, ripping her gown to shreds as she screamed and shouted, fighting it off with all of her might. With the darkness of the night, only lit by the flashing colours of its eyes that fluttered above her face with their menacing intent, she was not sure what had happened. All she knew was that for a moment, she had gotten herself free somehow. She turned and ran, only to find her sister pacing in the garden, awoken by the commotion outside. They quickly clambered along the pathway and grabbed the door handle to fling it open. But as they arrived, she felt the sharp claws of Jack's hand on her neck, tearing at her flesh, causing excruciating pain. She fell forward into the house, releasing herself from the firm grip of the menace behind them. She lay covered in cuts, bruises, torn clothes, and fresh blood. Her sister turned to the darkness outside of the doorway to see that the space was now clear and quiet. Spring-Heeled Jack had sprung into the air and vanished. Only 9 days had passed, and rumours of Jane's attack were spreading faster than a fire amongst the city. But this, of course, could not bring life to a halt. People still needed to go to work, eat and drink, to see friends and family. This was the case for Lucy, who was now walking home with her sister at her side after visiting their beloved brother in Limehouse. The sisters' conversations were typical as they huddled together on the cold night of February, wrapping themselves tightly in the fabric of their coats. They were still fresh into their journey when passing along Green Dragon Alley, a quiet road that had always rewarded them with safe passage. But on this night, this quiet road held a sinister secret in the shadows. Ahead of them, standing by the side of the road in the distance, cloaked by the darkness of the night, was a man whom Lucy's sister would later describe as having a gentlemanly appearance, tall and thin, with a long cloak wrapped around themselves to disguise against the blackness of the city even more. Standing at an angle, holding a lamp or a bullseye in his hand to light his view, one that resembled one of a police officer. They had no reason to fear this gentleman, or so they thought, so they continued their merry way towards him carelessly. "Let's hurry home, I'm so cold," Lucy whimpered to her sister with a giggle, taking a couple of steps forward in the hopes that it would cause her sister's pace to quicken as she attempted to keep up. But this playful, cunning plan was to be short-lived. The moment Lucy arrived beside the gentlemanly figure, it shot around sharply, lifting its cape and blasting a quantity of blue flame from its mouth into her cold face. In her shock, deprived of sight and sensation, she stumbled backwards and fell, slamming hard against the rock floor below. Her sister screamed with such intensity and fear that even their brother in his home at Limehouse could hear it, rushing out the door to find his siblings, whom he had inadvertently left alone with Jack in the cold night. Lucy lay on the floor, the white and blue flames flickering through her mind as her physical body seized into violent fits, while her sister jumped to the ground to help her. She looked up at the fire-breathing gentleman that stood above them. But this time, Spring-heeled Jack did not use those heels. He did not disappear into the shadow with haste or with cackling laughter. Instead, he simply smiled and turned to walk away, strolling up the city road without a care in the world, as the seizures it had inflicted continued through the night. The demonic figure of Spring-heeled Jack may have been pushed aside by Jack the Ripper's explosive entrance in the late 1800s, taking over the mantle as the darkest Jack in town. However, this fiery phantom haunted the United Kingdom for decades. The first recorded sighting of Spring-heeled Jack was in the very first year of the Victorian era, 1837. These sightings continued until the early 20th century, with his demonic presence haunting the streets of England as late as 1904. There are many theories about what this mystical, mischievous, devilish being was. The legend spread far and wide, becoming a household name due to the stories of its strange, inhuman features and the almost magical ability to make extraordinary leaps that even the highest jumpers in the animal kingdom would struggle to perform. Due to this and the outlandishness of its attacks, it became the topic of numerous works of fiction across the Victorian period. Spring-heeled Jack was described by those that claimed to have laid eyes on him as having a horrifying and fear-inducing appearance, with long, clawed hands and eyes that resembled red balls of fire in the darkness. Reports varied on his attire and stature, the most common being that he wore a helmet with a fitted garment in white, with a consistent theme throughout most sightings of a devilish-like appearance. Others claimed he was tall and thin, with the appearance of a gentleman, something that draws comparisons to the now famous image of Jack the Ripper. On a more abstract level, several reports mentioned that he could breathe out blue and white flames from his mouth, and that his claws were fixtures, sharp metallic weapons attached to his fingertips like Freddy Krueger. And whilst this being rarely spoke, some people claimed that he could speak English as if he came from here. In October 1837, a young woman named Mary Stevens left her parents in Battersea and made her way towards Lavender Hill, where she worked as a servant. When she was passing through Clapham Common, a strange figure reportedly leapt at her from the shadow of the alleys. He gripped her arms instantly, using his strength to overpower her whilst kissing her face and ripping away at her clothes so he could feel her skin with his claws that she claimed were cold and clammy as those of a corpse. Amid her horrified panic, Mary screamed for help with all of her might, drawing out several residents, leaving the devilish attacker to disappear with haste. The residents who had gathered continued their search for the attacker, but he was never found. It was only the next day that the demonic presence reportedly appeared again, this time choosing a very different victim indeed. The currently unnamed assailant reportedly jumped in the way of a passing carriage, causing the driver to lose control, crashing nearby and severely injuring himself. According to several eyewitness accounts, the figure cackled in a high-pitched ring of laughter as it jumped clear over a wall, one that was over 9 feet in height. Over time, the presence of this entity spread across the city until eventually the press caught wind of it. Shortly after, the devilish, man-like creature was publicly named Spring-Heeled Jack. It was in February 1838 that Spring-Heeled Jack rose to his most infamous, with the events I covered in my retelling of the legend. It must be said that I only added dialogue and content where the narrative required it. I sincerely tried to keep it as factually accurate to the reports of the time as possible, including some of the lines that were straight out of the witness accounts. The events of the story I told of Mary and Lucy were covered by the press, most notably a piece in the Times, one of the most prominent newspapers in the UK and one that is still going strong as one of the primary sources of news to this very day. After these attacks, vigorous efforts were put in place by the police to find the culprit of these monstrous, strange crimes, but it was all to no avail. It was not long before Spring-Heeled Jack became one of the most popular characters of the Victorian era in a time long before the Ripper walked the streets. His ongoing exploits were reported in national newspapers and had become the subject of several penny dreadfuls. His story even appeared in plays in some of the cheaper theatres at the time. The reports of Spring-Heeled Jack became more commonplace and, some would say inevitably, more outlandish. In the Brighton Gazette in April 1838, a gardener at Rose Hill in Sussex had reportedly been terrified by a being of otherworldly prospects. This was picked up on by the Times, who also ran the story claiming that the being had made its way to the Sussex coast. The gardener had claimed that it actually appeared in the shape of a bear or something similar. It reportedly caught the gardener's attention by growling before climbing the garden wall and running along it before jumping to the ground and chasing him. Once it had well and truly frightened the life out of the gardener, it clambered up the wall once again and left into the darkness. This legend was taken seriously by officials at the time, and quite rightly so, as something was going on in the city's dark corners. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cohen, held a meeting in January 1838, responding to a number of these reports that were continuing to pop up from all over the city, many of which suggested the attacks were those of people disguised as ghoulish creatures. The Lord Mayor had only recently received an anonymous letter from somebody marked as a resident of Peckham that suggested several aristocratic gentlemen had laid wagers with each other to dress up in various disguises and scare young women. The letter read, "It appears that some individuals of, as the writer believes, the highest ranks of life, have laid a wager with a mischievous and foolhardy companion, that he durst not take upon himself the task of visiting many of the villages near London in 3 different disguises: a ghost, a bear, and a devil, and moreover, that he will not enter a gentleman's gardens for the purpose of alarming the inmates of the house. The wager has, however, been accepted, and the unmanly villain has succeeded in depriving several ladies of their senses, 2 of whom are not likely to recover, but to become burdens to their families. At one house, the man rang the bell, and on the servant coming to open the door, this worse than brute stood in no less dreadful figure than a spectre clad most perfectly. The consequences was that the poor girl immediately swooned, and has never from that moment been in her senses. The affair has now been going on for some time, and, strange to say, the papers are still silent on the subject. The writer has reason to believe that they have the whole history at their finger ends, but through interested motives are induced to remain silent." A member of the audience within this meeting would confirm this letter to be true, stating that servant girls about Kensington, Hammersmith, and Ealing tell dreadful stories of this ghost or devil. The mayor reportedly believed these events had been greatly exaggerated and that the events were seemingly impossible. However, a servant girl at Forest Hill had stated that she had been scared into fits by a figure in a bear's skin. He trusted her and therefore accepted that something was most definitely going on in the streets of London. He believed that whoever it was causing this mischief would be caught and punished, and thus the investigation began. The police themselves were also skeptical of the tales, not fully convinced that it was ever a single individual causing havoc. Many believed it was a combination of lies, copycats, opportunists, and those who had started it to begin with, a group of people dressing up and carrying out the attacks. That's not to say that there was any shortage of suspects. Shortly after the Jane Alsop incident, a man called Thomas Milbank was tried at Lambeth Street Court for her assault, as Milbank had been overheard boasting in a local pub, the Morgan Arms, that he was Spring-Heeled Jack. The arresting officer, James Lee, claimed that he was certain that this man was indeed the right man. When Lee arrested him, Milbank was wearing white overalls similar to those worn by Jane Alsop's attacker. Investigations uncovered a discarded coat and candle nearby. However, Milbank escaped conviction due to the belief in the entity's existence. The victim, Jane Alsop, would insist that her attacker had breathed fire out of its mouth and that she had not imagined it, and fire breathing was simply something that Thomas Milbank could not do. It was during this time that the figure had grown into infamy across many households, pushed further into the lives of the general public through 3 pamphlet publications claiming to be based on real events. These were not to be considered stories of fiction, although historians believe it was, at the very least, heavily embellished. Unfortunately, the only surviving copies of these are said to have perished during the Blitz after the British Library, where the copies were kept, was hit. By 1843, the sightings of Spring-Heeled Jack had calmed, allowing it to continue its hauntings as a myth amongst the people of England. By now, it had become one of the most popular characters of the period, now becoming a consistent character in the pages of Penny Dreadfuls, and also the growing stage productions. He even made appearances within children's Punch and Judy productions, with the usual devilish character being renamed Spring-Heeled Jack. However, just because the frightful tales of Spring-Heeled Jack had lessened across the streets of London does not mean that they ended entirely. In fact, his horrors had seemingly spread further afield, leaping across the country to torment the towns. A report from Northamptonshire would state that a sighted being was the very image of the devil himself, with horns and eyes of flame. In 1847, an investigation in Teignmouth, Devon, led to the eventual arrest of Captain Finch after being charged with assault against women, during which he is said to have been curiously described as disguised in a skin coat, which had the appearance of bullock's hide, a skull cap, horns, and a mask. Many years later, in November 1872, a report was published in the News of the World, reporting that Peckham was in a state of commotion owing to what is known as the Peckham ghost, a mysterious figure quite alarming in appearance. Two girls, known as the daughters of the headmaster of Dulwich College and their governess, were the ones to report that they had witnessed an 8-foot-tall, cloaked man walking quickly across the street. The governess would go on to say that the man threw off his cloak, revealing that he was enveloped in white, with his arms outstretched in front of him. The girls screamed as the man suddenly leapt into the air, landing on a nearby roof that was around 9 feet high. In the article about this sighting, the newspaper wrote that it was, in fact, Spring-Heeled Jack, the being who had terrified a past generation. In 1877, one of the most notable sightings of Spring-Heeled Jack took place, with the reports now coming from a group of soldiers that had been stationed at Aldershot Garrison. According to the reports at the time, a sentry out on duty at the North Camp had found his attention drawn to a strange figure in the darkness, one that he claimed was advancing towards him. The soldier challenged the mysterious figure, but this did not deter them from approaching. The figure instead came up beside the soldier and slapped him in the face several times. The sentry shot his gun at the figure, but according to his testimony, this had no effect. However, it has been questioned whether the soldier was carrying blanks. According to the eyewitness testimony, once fired at, the figure disappeared into the darkness with astonishing bounds. Years later, in a 1922 publication, Lord Ernest Hamilton would release a memoir where he would mention this sighting. However, here the story changes, now occurring in the winter of 1879 after his regiment had moved location to Aldershot. He would also claim that similar situations had occurred before the move in Colchester during 1878. Lord Ernest also claimed that the panic this figure had created had grown so wide that the Aldershot sentries had been issued ammunition with the order to shoot at the figure on sight. It was after this order that the figure suddenly stopped appearing, leading Lord Ernest to conclude that these were most likely pranks carried out by one of his fellow officers. He even named his main suspect, a Lieutenant Alfrey. However, there are no records that indicate any court-martial offences against this name. Around the year of 1888, further up north in Everton, Liverpool, Spring-Heeled Jack was allegedly spotted once again, this time on the rooftops of St. Francis Xavier's Church. By now, the name of Spring-Heeled Jack had become firmly equated with the boogeyman, especially within the confines of London. His name was used by Victorian parents to scare children into behaving, telling them that if they were not good, Spring-Heeled Jack would leap up and peer through their bedroom windows in the night. In 1904, there was another reported sighting in Liverpool, creating a panic amongst some once more. It seemed as though this devilish being would never be too far away from our thoughts and fears, forever haunting the dark corners of Britain. However, all that changed when true horrors of humanity blasted into our lives with the Great Wars. And with them, it seemed that the story of Spring-Heeled Jack had sprung away into the shadow, just as fast as he had initially arrived. If you're still with me, then I know you share the same passion for folklore and urban legends that drives this show. But to keep bringing you these stories, I need your help. Every season comes to life with the incredible support of listeners like you on Patreon. For just £3 a month, less than the price of a small coffee, you can help ensure that this show continues to thrive, with shorter breaks between seasons and even more content available. But that's not all. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll unlock exclusive perks like access to our bonus series, Modern Myths, where we dive into lesser known but equally captivating tales like the Hodag, Black-Eyed Children, the Dark Watchers, and many more. You'll gain instant access to our entire library of bonus content the moment you join, with new chapters coming each season. You'll also get a behind-the-scenes look at how the show is made, discounts on merchandise, and an invitation to our private group chat, where you can connect with me directly and share your love for urban legends with a community of like-minded enthusiasts. Plus, as a special treat, I randomly select patrons to feature in upcoming stories, so you might find yourself becoming part of the very legends we explore. Supporting us on Patreon isn't just about subscribing. It's about joining a team dedicated to preserving and expanding on our collection of folklore. Your contribution directly fuels the research, production, and growth of the show, helping us continue this incredible journey together. So, if you're ready to take the next step and become an integral part of the Urban Legends community, head over to our Patreon page via the link in our show notes and choose the paid subscription. I'm looking forward to seeing you there, where we can keep these tales alive. And now, back to the legend. For decades, Spring-Heeled Jack's influence lived amongst Britain's households throughout the Victorian years. However, many skeptical investigators have asserted that the story of Spring-Heeled Jack was an exaggeration of the truth, altered through mass hysteria. A perfect storm of confusion, fear, imagination, anxieties, and many other sociological issues contributing to its story. If we were to watch the actual events that had occurred on those eyewitness accounts in real time, we would most likely see something far tamer than the urban legend it became would suggest. Some of these stories are likely true to the extent that these individuals were attacked. That is something that we must remember, that there were actual victims amongst the chaos. It is harder to appreciate, understand, or see amongst the city smog that crept down every crevice of the story, filling it with so much that it blurs the lines between fact and fiction. Britain has always been a mixture of countries built upon folklore and tales of mythological beings. Superstition is very much in our blood, and our will to believe without question clouds our clarity when an event occurs that we wish to be accurate, even against our better judgment. The streets of London in the 19th century were rapidly changing due to the Industrial Revolution. Mechanisms that ran with water and steam led to Britain becoming the leading commercial nation in the world. Factories must have seemed, to those walking on the streets, to be being built on every corner. Towers blowing out dark smog into the air, blocking so much natural light with the grey smoke of the new age. The newly created trains and forms of transport across the country created what must have felt like a smaller, more connected Britain. More and more people headed into the capital looking for an opportunity to better themselves and their lives. And with these, people also came with their different cultures, ideas, and folklore from every town and village across the island. And in London, they were suddenly slammed together into the mixing pot of a city. The streets had quickly grown crowded and cramped, with disease and illness running wild across the working-class families due to a mixture of poverty, poor hygiene, and an underdeveloped understanding of medicine. All of this comes from anxieties and fears that manifest in the stories we tell. Essays have been written repeatedly about how cinema reflects the times of our society, with joyful, happy films filled with laughter and music coming shortly after the war. During the Cold War, it became common for the villain of action films to be Russian. After 9/11, the campy, silly world of rom-coms and over-the-top action suddenly had to make room for more grounded and dark stories in their Hollywood blockbusters. Those in the 19th century had no cinemas to head to, no televisions to represent their fears and anxieties to release them in some cathartic manner. Instead, They were told and retold in the form of stories. Perhaps somebody took this to the extreme, becoming the embodiment of these fears like a real-life supervillain. In a new world of smoke, metal, and fire, it all seems far too coincidental that the being that the country feared for so long was himself pieced together with metal and fire. The Penny Dreadful stories of Spring-Heeled Jack would also play on these ideas, with it also being named Steel Jack before the Spring-Heeled Jack moniker became its official title. Now, although I do not believe in the devilish creature that is Spring-Heeled Jack, I am fascinated by the psychology at play regarding the events of the Victorian period. The claims about the origins of this paranormal being have been put forward by many, bringing out vastly different interpretations and beliefs. Some believe that Jack was an extraterrestrial entity with a body that closely represents ours with key differences. This belief suggests that his eyes were, in fact, reflective, and this is what would confuse the victims into believing they were seeing fire shining from the inside of their sockets. The belief continues to explain that its breath was phosphorus, and its superhuman ability to jump so high was due to a high-gravity world from which it originated, requiring far stronger legs than we needed on Earth. Others suggest that the origin is more supernatural than sci-fi, claiming that he was, in fact, a demon that had either accidentally or purposely been summoned into this world by those who were practitioners of the occult. It had even been suggested that it was perhaps manifested to our plane purposefully, with no other agenda than to create turmoil and chaos amongst the citizens of London and further afield. There is no denying that there was objectively a large amount of hyperbole regarding this urban legend. To that, most agree, with the reality mixing with the caricatures that had been created in the Penny Dreadfuls or the stories being retold with accidental embellishments as it's misremembered and misreported. There was no database to look back on and check in the Victorian era, meaning most of what was said was word of mouth, only opening themselves up for accidental and yet inevitable changes. But most also agree on the indisputable fact that something was happening over these years. Attacks were taking place. Where the voices differ is simply where the fact ends and the fiction begins.
Urban Legends is researched, written and produced by Luke Mordew. Original score by Billy Jupp, with additional sounds from storyblocks.com. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, click subscribe on your chosen podcast provider and delve into the mysteries of our previous and future chapters. To find more, including merchandise, video content, images and more, visit urbanlegendsfolklore.com. If you have more information or a correction on something mentioned in this chapter, please get in touch through our website. We aim to ensure that all information provided is accurate and up to date, and this remains a top priority. If you want to support the show, receive early access, and have more of a say in what we do, then become a patron by clicking the link in our show notes. For these chapters in video format, simply search Urban Legends Folklore on YouTube. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and Threads, and join our Facebook group by searching Urban Legends Folklore.